His heart was set on Jerusalem, not in triumph, but in lament, right? Jerusalem, Jerusalem. He mourned for the city that rejected the prophets, that silenced those who cried out for justice. He said, "How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." That beautiful feminine image of God there. But that important line, "you were not willing." Right? Jesus longed to protect and to nurture, to bring people into the safety of God's radical grace and reconciling love. But so often, we refuse to be gathered. This passage is deeply prophetic, right? Jesus identifies himself as a prophet, and it speaks to systems of oppression and to forces that resist God's reign of love and restorative justice. But it also speaks to the concept of Jubilee, a biblical vision that remains relevant today. The concept of Jubilee that we can read about in the 25th chapter of Leviticus was God's economic and social reset button. Every 50 years, debts were forgiven, enslaved people were freed, and land was returned to its original stewards. Right? Jubilee was a divine mandate for economic justice, ensuring that wealth did not become too concentrated, that communities were not permanently impoverished, and that the land was not endlessly exploited. But Jubilee was more, much more than just economic reform. It was also an expression of God's radical grace, right? It declared that no one was beyond redemption, that no person or nation should be trapped forever in the consequences of past oppressions. It was a sacred call to break cycles of poverty and enslavement, not because it was deserved, but because it was necessary for justice and reconciliation. And Jesus himself proclaimed Jubilee. Right at the very beginning of his ministry, he stood in the synagogue and he read from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, release to the captives, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." That 50th year, that Jubilee. Right? This is Jubilee language that Jesus was speaking, language of transformation. And it is language not just of social and economic transformation, but also of reconciliation. Right? Jubilee is not just about setting individuals free from debt or slavery. It is about restoring relationships between people, between nations, and between humans and our creation. And Jubilee is not just an ancient principle that we find in the Bible. It speaks to our world today. Right now, slide please. Right now, next please, thank you. More than 3 billion people on our planet, more than 40% of our planet's population, are living in countries that are experiencing debt crisis. 4 in every 10 people on our planet live in nations that spend more on repaying foreign debt than they spend on health care or education. Next slide, please. This is not just an economic crisis. I believe it is a moral crisis. The biblical call to cancel debt is not about charity. It's about justice. Right? It is about acknowledging that many of these debts were accumulated through unfair economic systems, colonial exploitation, and global inequalities that continue to harm the most vulnerable. If we look at that map of the world, which is actually to scale, often we see continents that look wider than that, but that's actually because some folks, when they're creating maps, emphasize certain regions of the planet. So this is actually to scale. It hasn't been narrowed. And we can see some of the countries, the red countries, that are experiencing debt crisis. Notice that Canada is not. There is no risk in Canada. And actually, in the past years, even during the pandemic, our country has done very well. And we have the lowest debt of any of the G7 countries. But many of those countries in the south are experiencing great difficulty. And notice that even the country to the south of us has less stability and much more debt than we do. Wealthy countries and corporations, because a lot of this debt is held privately, they continue to extract resources from heavily indebted nations and indigenous lands, leading to human rights violations and severe ecological destruction. So this is not just economic injustice, it's ecological injustice. And there is a term that was new to me, but it's ecological debt. So if we look at the debt situation, we know that many of those countries, those red countries, owe an exorbitant amount of money to private corporations and to other governments. But many of those creditors owe a great ecological debt back to them, because it is the wealthy countries and the wealthy corporations that have benefited the most from fossil fuels, deforestation, and industrial pollution. So they owe a deep debt to some of these other countries. And the global debt crisis is not just about numbers, right? It's about living things. It's about people. So Maria is a farmer and mother of 3. Maria lives in Zambia, one of the countries most of the way down in Africa, just above the green section. There's a dark red section. That's Zambia. And her country is burdened by foreign debt. So Maria works hard on her farm, but she is forced to grow cash crops for export to other places instead of growing food that can feed her own family. And her land has been depleted by overproduction, and her water has been polluted by a mining company owned by a foreign corporation. There is no health care available to her children because the government is obligated to pay off these exorbitant debts, so it cannot invest in things like health care, things we consider necessities. This is what unaddressed debt looks like, right? It's not just numbers on a ledger. It is human suffering, and it is ecological devastation, and it has become systemic inequality, right? Millions of people in indebted countries face futures shaped not just by personal hardship, but by economic decisions made far away. Decisions that prioritize debt repayment over human life. What is life worth? So there is deep suffering. And we have lots to lament about. But there is hope. There is always hope. And even in Maria's community, they are finding hope because they have begun organizing and advocating for debt relief and sustainable farming practices. They believe that change is possible, and so should we. By canceling unjust debts, we can ensure that families like Maria's are not trapped in cycles of poverty. So the call for Jubilee is urgent. It is urgent because it is about radical grace in action, and it is about reconciliation made real. It's not just an ancient concept. It is a present-day source of hope for many people and many countries. A vision for a world where economic justice, ecological healing, and reconciliation go hand in hand. Next slide. By addressing the root causes of debt and advocating for systemic reform, we can create a more equitable world where the welfare of people and the planet are prioritized. This requires speaking truth to power. To this end, there is currently a global petition that is being signed, and it urges creditors and political leaders to cancel unjust and unsustainable debts, to reform the global financial system to address the root causes of the debt crisis, and to establish a binding and comprehensive debt framework within the United Nations. This petition is going to be presented to a minister in our government. It is going to be presented when the G7 meets here in Canada later this year. It's going to be presented at COP30, an environmental meeting in Brazil, I believe, in the fall. We are about gathering signatures because there's lots of things that we feel like we can't do, but my friends, this is something we can do. We can at least put our name to paper and speak to power in that way. So Susan Curran has brought with her a hard copy of this petition. So I invite you, please, to give it consideration, and I encourage you to sign it today after our worship service. May we walk the path of Jesus, not turning back in fear, but moving forward in faith, speaking truth to power, and embracing the radical grace that is Jubilee. Amen.